As a real estate investor, once you get a house under contract for a great price, in order to make sure that you get paid and the deal doesn't fall apart, you just email that contract to a title company and they take care of everything else. But one thing you need to make sure of is that that title company is investor friendly, because these deals can be harder than the retail deals that most title companies do. And if they're investor friendly, that won't prohibit them from closing the deal on time. They'll be focused on making sure you get paid. So here's how to find an amazing investor-friendly title company.
The DealMachine REI podcast. Everything you need to know to get started in real estate investing.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the DealMachine Real Estate Investing podcast, where our mission is to give you everything that you need to know to get into real estate investing. So I'm David, and I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Haywood from Heritage Home Investments. How you doing, Ryan?
I am doing great.
Awesome. So if you guys don't know, Ryan's done 380 deals right outside of Kansas City, Missouri, where he started in 2019, and he took a 30-day wholesaling challenge. And if you don't know what wholesaling is, it's where you actually find a really great investment property and you get paid $10,000, $20,000 for passing that off to an investor who does have cash, and you get paid for finding that deal. On my end, 9 rental properties in, I've got $1.6 million in assets and $160,000 in yearly income. And we've got a list of episodes we've gone through today. I'm just going to run through, we've talked about how to get started, lead generation, direct mail and return mail, answering calls, how to do an appointment, how to analyze a deal, how to estimate renovation costs, how to find buyers, and how to present a deal to buyers. And that brings us to this episode where we're going to talk about finding a title company in your area that can help you with these wholesale or real estate investor transactions. And we've got a special guest today, our first guest ever, Palak Shah. How are you doing, from Hudley Title here in Austin, Texas?
Good. How are you guys doing today?
Doing very, very good.
Yeah.
So Palak, I was just wondering, could you tell us why and when you started your title company? Because the way we met is the way I tell everyone to find a title company when they're going to do their first wholesale deal, is because some title companies will not even know what a wholesale deal is. And it will be challenging for you to do that deal. So you want to know who that is in your area. And the number one way is to go to a group on Facebook for your area that investors are posting deals in and ask who they use, or just go to a meetup. You can Google real estate investing meetup in your city, and then go to one of those meetups and ask investors who they use. And that is exactly how I met Palak. And so I know he's the one lots of legitimate wholesalers use here. And so Palak, why don't you tell us again, or for the first time, how and when and why you started your title company?
Yeah, sure. So it was actually almost 10 years ago, but I actually started the title company because I was buying a house. So I purchased a house here in Austin. So we were originally based in Austin. We do things across Texas, but I was buying the house. I put a contract down on it. It was accepted on like the July 4th weekend. And I didn't actually close on that property until February of the next year. It was almost like 9 months or so. Turns out, it was the actual process of finding the initial house was smooth, fairly easy, but the process of closing was the worst consumer experience I've ever had. We were with a specific title company that starts with an S. Maybe I won't give it directly to say the name, but I couldn't get a hold of the escrow officer. I didn't know what was going on. I got to the point through those months where I was literally setting up meetings associated with the escrow officer and the investors who currently own the property and myself and my loan officer. And we'd show up and nobody from the title company would be there, and we'd be like, it's been 3 months. What's the deal? Why are we not closing? I couldn't even get a response from them. Eventually they figured it out, and it turns out it was literally just because there was 2 mechanics liens of the property, which the total amount was like around $15,000. So they just standard liens that had to be paid for by the seller, and they just didn't do the work on it, or they just deprioritized it, or whatever it was, but they just were not getting things done.
So can you back up and say what's a lien?
Oh, sure. So a lien is anything that's consider a lien can be multiple different things, but there's basically what they call voluntary and involuntary liens. But essentially, a lien is a placement on a property that basically guarantees or assumes some sort of financial assumption associated with that property, right? So it could be anything. That's a very broad meaning, but basically, and I'm trying to keep it simple, but basically it's anything where it might say someone owes someone else money, and this property is securing that assumption of who owes who somebody money. And I use two categories of involuntary and voluntary. And the reason why that's important to note is voluntary is your mortgage lien, right? You signed up for that. If you take out a secondary HELOC, which is a home equity loan, all those kinds of things, there's something that the seller signed up for, they know about, and it's fine. Involuntary can be judgments, it can be tax liens, it can be, in that situation,
So
in my
like,
house.
let's say if they hired somebody to do construction, but then they never ever paid that person.
Correct.
If the contractor had proof, they could put a lien on the property, right?
Correct, and that's a great example of a mechanics lien, where that's essentially what happened, right? Let's say you have the roof replaced, and the roof cost you $10,000 to replace, and you just never pay the guy. The guy can put a lien on your property and say, "Here's my proof that I did this work on this property, and this person owes me $10,000, and you're gonna have to pay it."
Yes.
And what's really important on those things is when you're closing, you either have to pay it or you have to get a release, or there's a third option, which is essentially you're going to fight it, but that means taking it to court and going through that entire process, and that is not a short process. It's not an easy process, and obviously it will also cost you money because you will likely need to get a lawyer involved.
So, okay, it sounds like your property did have some liens on it, okay? And then the title company that you were using, they found that?
So they found it, but they didn't work on it. So when they do title examination, which is that process of going in and seeing what liens are on the property, they found that. And their next part of their job is they have what they call title clearing, which means they go work on that stuff. They say, okay, we've got these 3 issues. We need to go deal with it. And in this scenario, when you have a mechanics lien, it's as simple as calling the guy. The information is on there and saying, hey, give me a payoff or give me a release. And they basically just didn't do that work. So they sat on it for months and months and months, and they lied and said that they tried to call the person. Never really happened.
And this is why it's so important to find a title company that is investor friendly, because a title company makes the same amount of money whether the deal is clean and easy or whether the deal is actually hard. And so you were using a retail title company that they were like, I'd rather just find some more deals that are a lot easier because we're going to get paid the same than try to work through this tough deal that you brought, that you were in the middle of, right?
Exactly.
However, an investor-friendly title company knows their reputation depends on working through challenges that often come up with investment deals. And that's why it is in their interest to work on those hard deals, right? I'm guessing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
even
for an
to
investor, you want the title company that's really focused on their reputation for helping out investors.
And it's a great point to make, and I'd expand on it real quick on 2 things. There's 2 things I always tell people when they ask me about it, and the first one is most people don't know this, but escrow officers at the vast majority of other title companies are paid a bonus for the deal. So as you can imagine, it incentivizes them to work the easy deals, not the hard deals, and get through that, which is exactly what you were saying earlier. And the other thing that they don't realize is when you have a lot of these sort of purchase deals, which are the easy deals, what they do at other title companies is they work on the deal this week that's closing next week because it's easy. I only need a day or 2 to figure it out, solve it, and get everything done, and that's easy. But when it comes to investor wholesale type deals, those things might take weeks. And so what you end up having is people telling you 3 days beforehand, oh, I need all this stuff. And you're like, well, you could tell me this 30 days ago. It's going to take a while. Now we're going to push closing because of all this, and you got all the problems associated with that.
Also, I mean, actually, some investor deals do close really quickly too, right? It's like you get it under contract and you're guaranteeing the seller that they'll get cash in 7 days.
Yeah, and if title's clear, then you usually don't have much of a problem, right? So like our internal process is we get the deal ready within 3 to 5 business days from when it's opened. And that's when we get title back. And we've closed deals within 7 days because title comes back and it's cleared and it's not a problem.
That's also something, David, that we should mention is in your contract. Make sure that you have an exclusion so you have a 7-day close with an exclusion of title issues.
Gotcha.
Because if they
Okay.
do come up and you need to delay it, you're not stepping outside the bounds of the contract by letting those title issues take too long.
Correct.
So we have that in ours. It's 7 days per clear title, or if could be delayed if there are any title issues.
Got it.
And just a slight expansion on that is if you are including anything associated with like, hey, we're going to pay for closing costs or anything, make sure you have something that says we won't pay for anything that's a lien, essentially, right? So whether it's a tax lien, whatever
Lien
might
or
be
back
there.
taxes.
Exactly, yeah. Because you don't want to be the one, I mean, that could be, $100,000 or something like that, and you don't want to be the one paying for that.
So basically, if you're a brand new investor, you've never done a deal before, here's the order of things. You find a motivated seller, you talk with them, and you get a contract to buy their property. And then what you do is you just email your contract to the title company and they handle the rest and make sure you get paid, essentially, is how this works. And the other thing, Palak, you said is an escrow officer. Can you explain what is escrow and what is the escrow officer's role?
Sure. So escrow is just the sort of fancy name, I think, of the people who are the independent middleman or third party in a transaction, right? So legally speaking, it's our job to make sure that the contract is executed the way the contract states. So the buyer does their responsibilities, the seller does their responsibilities, which can include everything from making sure a survey has been ordered, or making sure that the seller provides all the information we need in order to clear liens, et cetera. So that's sort of people call it escrow companies or title companies. It's very interchangeable. In certain states, there's sort of two sides of the same coin. But all that really means is if you call it title, it means it's the guys who are doing the title search, and escrow are the guys who are actually doing the closing part of it. But yeah, so they're both two sides of the coin on that side. Escrow is generally considered the guys who are doing the closing part of it, and the title is considered the people who are clearing the liens and validating the liens on that side. You generally won't interact with anyone besides the escrow team. That's who you're going to talk to. And your escrow officer is a fully licensed individual in the vast majority of states, especially Texas and like California, New York, Florida, these like big places that people play a lot in. It's a fully licensed person, and they're responsible for being sort of your point of contact throughout that entire process. And making sure everything runs smoothly, essentially. They're the experts when it comes to title and all those kinds of things.
So I didn't encounter the word escrow until I did my first real estate deal, but I also realized escrow is not only a real estate term. I actually bought a domain name and I used an escrow company, and it was a third party that was holding my money, because if I just wired the person the money, they could run off with my money and never give me the domain name. So it's like a third party who holds the money, and then the person gives me control of the domain name. And then the third party's like, okay, everybody's happy. Now I will release the money.
Yes. And that's a great example of, if you think about the parallel to real estate, is you're not going to send $100K, whether it's you or a lender that you're working with, a hard money lender or whatever, to the seller and hope they sign the deed and hope they record the deed and all those kinds of things and it's all right. You send it to us. We hold that. We make sure everything's done correctly. And then when we close, then funds go to whoever they're supposed to go to. The deeds are recorded. All those kinds of things are done properly. And then, it's one of those things where it's heavily audited. There's a lot of legal work that goes into sort of what the states do and stuff. And it's a little bit of structure, but the good thing there is that we're not some Joe, not some average Joe can basically go sign up and become a title company or an escrow company. You have to be licensed. You have to get audited. You have to do all this financial proof stuff. So that way someone can't just send you money for a deal and then you turn around and like, that money is gone. I spent it for something or whatever, that money is essentially safe.
Ryan, that was a really good point about that line to put in the contract. Why don't you hit us with some more buzzwords that are title related?
So one thing that I want to know, I get a lot of questions from people about, hey, would you ever be interested in tax sale properties? Personally, I've never been one to go for a tax sale property because they have so many issues with title. When you're buying a tax sale property or you're going to the courthouse, you're essentially buying a property for what the back taxes are. But do you really get the property?
So no, so that's a great question, right? Because there's sort of like an order of priority, right? And the government sort of, as you can imagine, always has sort of first priority. So you don't pay your taxes, they're going to repossess the property, they're going to foreclose the property. The issue you run into is you're basically you're trying to take on title onto that property by paying whatever the outstanding tax amount might be, but there could be a bunch of other things associated with it. So let me give you sort of an example. Let's say you got a $150,000 home and it's got $25K in outstanding taxes. So you pay $25K and you think, man, I just got this home for $150K for $25K, right? But the reality is there's still an outstanding lien. There may still be an outstanding lien associated with the mortgage company, and the mortgage might be $100K. There could be other liens associated with it. And so you really want to check those things and validate those things before if you're going to take on that tax sale, right? Because those things aren't paid in that $25K, right? So let's just say the lender had $75,000 left on that loan, and the city came in foreclosing the property, and they basically got to it before the lender did. You still have to pay that lender because they have the right to foreclose on the property again and take it over and do that. So there's pieces of that you want to be clear about. And there's always a question too, if someone comes back and says, hey, that was my property and I was not receiving the tax notifications for it, and I didn't realize that the taxes were up, I'm ready to pay the taxes and any outdated fees, late fees, etc. to it, and reclaim my property. Now it's not, and that's again, it's not an easy thing because it's all situational. And what ends up happening in these things is you fight it out in court, right? Mm-hmm. And it might, so if someone comes back 10 years later, the courts might be like, well, it's too late, but if someone comes back 5 months later, it's like, okay, and you can prove that you moved and the stuff didn't get sent to you and you didn't know that, whatever. They might say, okay, we're going to force a sale of the property and then we're going to give it back to that person or whatever. So it can
really
be dangerous.
Tax sale could be maybe like a long-term investment, because from what I understand on tax sale is you pay the back taxes, and then after so long, how do you get the title?
So you effectively are granted title through the state at that point, but it's not a clean title, if that makes sense, right?
You couldn't sell it.
What happens is there's a deed that you have signed by the state or the county that gives it to you. It says, hey, Ryan, you own this now. But when you go to sell it, there's going to be title examination done on it. And there might be problems then, right? There might be an issue that says, hey, look, there's outstanding liens on this, or there's something else, or there's a hair ship thing or whatever. And the title company will say, yeah, you can sell this, but we won't provide title insurance to the buyer until you clear all these issues, right? And so you then are stuck in a situation where you have to say, I got to clear all these issues. And some of them might be fine. Some of them might be just pay somebody something and you don't mind, but some of them might be more difficult associated with that. So that's where you get into it, right? So if you're going to get a tax property, be prepared for the fact that, hopefully it's a really good deal. And then you can get a title company to do, an examination for it and tell you like, here's all the issues. Let's go get this figured out. Cause you might be spending 6 months, refurbishing the property. Well, you can go get all that sorted out and taken care of, because when you go to sell it, the buyer is ultimately going to want they're going to want title insurance, and especially if they have a lender. So and hopefully everybody knows, traditional lenders will always require title insurance. So you can't skip that part. So in order to get those things, you have to clear all the issues associated with it.
Okay. Ooh, speaking of title insurance, I wanted to hear you tell that story because I was like, what's title insurance cost? Like $1,000? That's what it does for in Indiana. I was like, how many times does the title company actually mess up and actually have to use the title insurance? Have you ever had that happen?
I've had it happen. Luckily, we're glad to say we've actually had 0 claims against us. So that's just, something I throw out there. But here's what I tell people about that and what happens. Let me give you a story I think is easiest. Is we used to work with an iBuyer, and we still do. But, iBuyers, if you guys know, they purchase a property, they turn it around and they flip it, kind of similar to investors, but they don't do any work, right, associated with it. So what was interesting was the iBuyer purchased a property with the title company that was a different title company. 3 months later, they found a buyer, they're flipping it, and they're selling it. And we look at it and we say, hey, there's an outstanding lien on this from the previous owners for like $50,000 for their home equity loan. And so we contact, and sometimes when things happen quickly, especially for investors and iBuyers and such, when you have only a couple months, the lenders might have not at that point processed the payoff and got that recorded. So it could be a legit thing. So we contacted the previous title company and we said, hey, did you guys pay this off? And their response was, yes, we did. Here's proof that they basically issue a letter that says, we accept responsibility that we have paid this off. We're confident that's there. Turns out they didn't. They messed up. So 6 months later, we get a call from the new owner saying, hey, I got a letter that they're foreclosing on me because this was never paid off. So in this scenario, this is a perfect example of why a buyer wants that title insurance. Is they were protected by our title insurance, and our title insurance had sort of what they call the default associated with this on the previous title company. So our lawyers come in, they put a halt on the foreclosure sale, so they make sure that doesn't happen. And then they go back to the previous title company and whoever made the mistake in that scenario, and they make them pay for whatever's there as an outstanding thing. So the buyer doesn't lose the house. The buyer doesn't pay anything. Yes, it's a hassle. It's a little bit of a pain, but sometimes you can't avoid those things. But at least you've got a lawyer, experienced lawyers that come in that deal with it for you, those kinds of things. So that's where these situations end up. And there are definitely some situations where you can even get criminal stuff, right? We had one where this was actually a friend of mine that did this a couple years ago. He bought a plot of land out in the middle of nowhere in Texas for like $1 million, and someone forged a signature on a deed and basically tried to take over the ownership of the property. If you didn't have title insurance, the situation would have been, I got to go figure all this out. I got to hire a lawyer. That's going to be very expensive and all this kind of things. But when you have a title insurance, you just tell the title company, hey, this happened. And they'll be like, all right, cool. We'll go figure this out for you, right?
Wow. I was so happy to hear that story because I've always wondered, what am I paying $1,000 for every time I buy one of these stinking houses?
Yeah.
Like, how is the title company really going to mess up? But it could have been from a transaction way before.
It could be from way before. It could be 3 generations ago. It could be, let's say even 4 or 5 years or 10 years ago, someone comes back and says, hey, this deed that went over to this dude over here in 2010, I never signed that. That was not me. It was forged, right? And you're like, well, that makes everything behind it invalid, essentially. He's claiming he wants the property back. So who's going to deal with that? And that's where title insurance will kick in and say, hey, we're gonna figure that out for you. If it goes to court and the judge says, yeah, it's their property, it was forged, that's clear. The nice thing is the buyer at least gets their money back, right?
Yeah.
So you get covered by that instead of sort of you're stuck and you lost, $150K and your property as well.
So as real estate investors, our value proposition is that we will provide speed and convenience. We'll close quickly and with cash. And part of that is that we are going to pay all the closing costs. So we are typically paying the title company. And so when you use an investor-friendly title company, they're also probably transparent with the total cost of closing that deal. A retail title company may not be as transparent. And I'm curious, maybe Ryan, you could go first. Can you tell us what you typically pay for title? And then Palak, I'd love to hear how that is structured for you in Texas. So
I think
Ryan's in Missouri.
our average is about $800 for title.
Does that include the title search as well as title insurance?
Yeah, that's all the fees, title insurance, title search, all of that stuff is almost $800 on these files. Now, I think it changes depending on how big of a purchase price it is. Is that right?
Yeah. So typically in most states, when the purchase price goes up, the cost goes up for those things. But
yeah. So we've averaged in the 800, but it just really depends on how big of a purchase.
What's the
price
average price house that you're working with, Ryan?
I think we're still in like the $20,000 to $30,000 on a house. They used to be. I mean, when we first started out, I was getting houses around 5,000, but we've cleaned so many of them up that they're just not available anymore. So yeah, normally
you made the neighborhood too nice.
Well, yeah, there's a lot less boarded houses in St. Joe, which is a really good feeling. I wanted to ask though, so what for a wholesale transaction from your perspective? So let's say I get a contract and I have an assignment agreement done and I bring it to you. What does that look like for you? And when you're doing title, what does it look like for the other side of like our person we're assigning it to? What does it look like for them?
Sure. So
can you say your cost too real quick?
Yeah, let me do that too as well. So the cost in Texas specifically is dictated by the state. So the nice thing there is that the cost of the actual title insurance is the same across the entire state of Texas, right? Now it's going to be different in different states. A prime example is California. There they set their own rates, and each title company is different. So it might be worth getting quotes in that sense. But in states generally where it's about 50% of states that the title price is set by the state's governing agency itself, there'll be the price of the title insurance, which is generally anywhere from like 0.5% to 1%. And it becomes cheaper as a percentage as the price goes up. So it comes closer to 1% when it's the lowest, when it's a lower value. And then the only other thing you're going to generally see on top of that that's added is what they call the escrow fee, which is usually a couple $100 per party. And so that's just sort of added on there to you as well. So those are the two major costs that you're going to have associated with that. Now, dollar-wise, essentially would be the same thing, right? So like a $20,000 property, let me pull it up here, owner's title insurance is $410, and the lender's what they call co-insurance, which means that you're buying at the same time, is just an extra $100. So $510, and then might be some escrow fee related to for a couple $100 for each one of those. So that's generally the price. I've looked at across all the states. You're not going to see, I don't think, a lot of different places. Iowa is one very specific place because it has sort of a state mandated system. It's very unique. But the rest of the country, adjusted for the sort of cost of living difference, it basically ends up being a little bit basically the same. So that's sort of the general cost and price of that. Then sort of the question around what people will see in terms of the fees that are there. So typically when you're the investor and you're going to be paying for all the closing costs associated with it, you're paying those closing costs. So you're paying the title insurance, right? Which, let me give you an idea. So like in Texas, 200, let's say like 125,000. That's closer to like $1,000 for title insurance, right? So you're going to pay that. You're going to pay what's called the escrow fee, right? Which is usually like $300 to $400 per side, which generally means that if you're paying all of it, you're paying both of those aspects. So that's going to be another like $800, let's say. Then you're going to be paying basically the fees associated with sort of the pass-through fees for doing some of the recording and deed preparation, right? And just to give you an idea, like a tax certificate's like $35. Preparing a deed is like $70. Your recording fees are going to be mattering on how many pages, might be like $30 to $100 type of thing. Now this is a place.
So the insurance is regulated. The other fees are not.
Correct.
The title company can charge whatever they want for those.
Correct. And that's a great, that is something I would tell everybody, is to go get quotes on that, right? Because like, for example, for us, we charge a flat $395 for each party. And then we provide a free mobile notary to both parties. Because one of the things we learn with investors is it's much easier to tell the seller, hey, we'll have a guy show up at your door, sign the paperwork, and leave and not worry about it. So we just wrap it all in and charge a flat price. But some guys will charge $200-$300 for the deed preparation. They'll charge mail fees. They'll charge wire fees. They'll charge courier fees. There's a lot of junk fees, unfortunately, that get charged into that. And that's definitely one of those things you want to ask people about and say, what are those costs before I commit to using you?
I've paid $150 for a mobile notary, so that's really nice. You guys give it for free.
Yeah, at Westwood, we don't nickel and dime people, a lot of the big title companies, just so you guys are aware and everyone's aware, is the deed prep, for example, is the fee for creating a deed, right? We charge like $70. A lot of these guys will have law offices that are part of the title company or whatever, or their buddies or whatever, and so they'll charge like $300 for that because they know you're not going to complain, and then basically they're getting it, they're making a higher price over to their friends and stuff. So be aware.
So
of
if you're taking down the property yourself, you'd pay those fees. But if you're assigning it, it's usually the investor that's actually, buying the deal. The person you're assigning it to as a wholesaler would pay all those fees, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Basically, you walk away with whatever your assignment fee is going to be. So whether you structure it as a flat dollar, like I'm making 10,000, or you structure it as I'm selling it to you for 60,000. My original contract is 50,000. That's 10,000. That's how you get it. It just gets passed on to the end buyer, essentially. So they are the ones who pay for everything.
Yes, but it's the wholesaler who gets it under contract in the first place that typically picks the title company to make sure that the deals all go smoothly.
Yes. Yeah. And you will get. So, I tell people, my philosophy on that is, obviously, if you're paying, or you are sort of your assigner, whoever you're assigning it to is going to be paying the title policy, the sort of understood across the United States method is that whoever's paying the title policy picks the title company. So you make that happen, and you get to choose who you want because they'll close. If the seller's adamant about, hey, I want to use my title company, my response always, and this will ruffle some people's feathers, but it's like, hey, well, then you pay for the title insurance, right? Because you're choosing, so you should pay for it, because you're going to ensure that, I don't know how good your guys are going to be, and I don't know how long they're going to take.
Yep. And when people we've had that happen where we're under contract and they're, it's like, hey, we're going to cover the closing costs. And so we'll turn all of the paperwork into our title company, and they're like, well, I want to use mine. And I'm like, well, then I'm not going to pay all the closing costs. Well, then it's fine. So it's like, as soon as they realize that it is the person who's acquiring the property that gets to pick that, especially when you're offering to pay it all, then that usually disarms them. One thing I want to know, and I know a lot of people, when it comes to the assignment, people get really nervous about that assignment fee being seen.
So, this is generally what I would say across the board, because there are some state and federal regulations around this. So the way it works is, in order for us to disperse funds to somebody, we can't just magically disperse a set of funds and ask for people to send us more money, right? So we can't be like, hey, investors, send me 50,000 and then also send me 10,000 where I'm going to keep secretly over here and I'm going to give it to the assigner, right? I can't do that, unfortunately, because all of this stuff is, tracked and audited. So we do what's called blind HUDs, and that's what you always want. You want a blind HUD, and what that means is that when the seller looks at that, they only see the seller's fees, right? They only see what they have on the seller's side, and the buyer only see the buyer's side. And what we do is sort of the default when we work with a lot of investors is we put the assignment fee on the buyer's side only, and that's the only place it shows up. And that's fine because the end investor knows that, hey, I'm paying this. I know I've got an assignment fee associated with it, and then that's not an issue. And the seller has no clue. right? And they don't see that, and they won't come back and question and be like, why are you making $10,000 more than what I'm getting out of this type of situation, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So if you've never done a wholesale deal, you may get the property under contract for $100,000, but then you turn around and you market it to an investor with cash for $120,000. And that difference there ends up being your assignment fee. That's the fee that you take home after this deal closes. And so what Ryan was saying was people feel uncomfortable because they have a relationship with the seller. They don't really feel comfortable telling the seller they're making $20,000 right off of their house without doing anything to it. And so, Palak, you've got the blind HUD, and the HUD stands for Housing and Urban Development, right? It's like a standardization organization
like a settlement statement.
It determines what that document says,
like, yeah.
right? So it's standardized no matter what company you're using. And then the seller will see one with exactly what they're receiving and less any fees if there are any. And then there's a different one for the buyer side. And since you do the mobile notary, they definitely won't see it because they're not there at the closing table at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, we print them and they're physically separate documents. So like, it's not even like the only way, not that it was happening, but the only way it could happen is like if someone gave you the wrong set of documents or something like that, right? But they're physically separate, so there's no fees listed on there. So they'll never have a clue. The only thing that ever comes up as a question, which I think is good for everyone to know, is the name on there might change, right? So let's say, Ryan's the one who's the assigner, and David, you're the buyer. So it's Ryan Co. is the original contract underneath there, and then David Co. is the new contract. So we're required to list David Co. on the top of that HUD as here's a new buyer. And since, we understand this and we're very investor friendly, one of the things that we just tell sellers if they ask about that is say they're just using a different LLC for the transaction because who wants to have a bunch of properties underneath the same LLC, right? So we can kind of, explain that away and people are usually fine with it. But that's the only thing that they will see that might be a little bit different associated with that.
And the assignment contract is literally just like, it could be a 2-sentence contract, right? It's like, so-and-so assigns this deal to this person for this fee.
Yes.
And that's a separate contract that the wholesaler also emails you so that you know who's ending up buying the property.
And the seller won't have any access to that either, too, as well. So they won't know that exists or anything like that.
So the realtor contract is 16 pages. The contract I use is like 3 pages. And I've actually heard you can buy a house on a napkin. You just need the buyer, the seller, the price, and the address. Have you ever done a deal with that small of a contract?
We've actually done one. Yeah, it's we've gotten like 1-page contracts where it's just like a couple of lines that basically states, "Hey, here's the sales price," right? And it's always interesting. So the thing I tell people if you're going to do that is, what you need to be careful about is there's not anything listed in terms of outs, right? So you might be fine. You might say, hey, I'm not putting any earnest money down or anything like that. I'm just giving you a contract for this. And then if you have title issues and we can't work it out, then I go my separate way, you go your separate way. But the real estate contracts you talk about, they're like, 15 to 30 pages. They have all these outs and stuff. And so you really should read your state associated contracts, see what you think is important, and then potentially put that in the small ones. But we've definitely got them. With those, it's usually like, hey, if there's any sort of argument because the guy might, let's say the buyer puts down $2,000 as earnest money and they can't close because there's a title issue, and let's say someone can't resolve that because the person won't sign or whatever, right? And now you get into an argument about who gets to keep the earnest money. And as a title company, we have to basically say, well, what does the contract say? And if the contract's not explicit about that, it doesn't give you an out, then it's like, hey, Ryan, David, you got to go fight about this for a little while until you come up with an answer, and then let us know, and then we will just disperse that then. Otherwise, we're just going to sit on this money until it's decided.
Right.
So that's your risk of like the very short contract associated with it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I use my 3-pager that I got at a meetup from somebody that was teaching wholesaling. It does have plenty of outs. It also says, but the whole purpose of it being short is because if somebody is in distress, the 16 pager can make them feel uncomfortable because it's so much to read.
Yep.
And the short contract can be written very plainly. You do need to have the outs that you mentioned. If something comes up during the inspection period, for example, that you could get an out and the earnest money would be returned to you.
Yep. Usually it's a protection against your guys out necessarily, right? Because in those situations, I think the seller is ready to sign and they don't care if it's one sentence or it's 2 pages, but you want some protection so that way, you can come back and be like, you guys, we can close this, then I'm getting my money back for my earnest money and those kinds of things. But there's nothing that there's no legal requirement that you have to use your real estate agent contract in your state, or it has to technically be drafted by a lawyer or anything. Really, you want it sort of to cover the things that it needs to cover, and then obviously signed and documented and dated. If you're going to use your own contract too, sometimes what I recommend is have people initial on every single page, so that way they can't claim that someone flipped out a page or changed a page on you. But otherwise, a three-page contract can work just fine as long as it's got the things that you need to cover you for, your own butt sort of, and making sure you can get out of it if you need to get out of it.
Amazing. We've got time for a few more questions. Ryan, have you ever had any interesting title stories happen over there in Kansas City, St. Joe, rather?
So we actually have one a really messed up one happening right now. It was really what sparked me to ask the tax sale question, because we purchased a property last August, and I just went ahead and what I've kind of started doing is just closing on these myself and then selling them. And so I bought this house, I closed on it, I paid all the closing costs. And then I turned around, I had the property cleaned out, and then we sold it. Well, we sold it, and the person that we sold it to called, and they called back and they're like, hey, somebody is there working on it and says they own it. And I'm like, that's odd. And so I just pulled it up. Actually, I pulled it up in DealMachine, and it had this other person's name as the owner. And I'm like, what the heck? How could that be? Because I bought it all the way, closed it, sold it, got it done at title. And then I sold it and we did it at title again. So to me, it should have been in her name. Well, what didn't get caught was that property was sold on the tax sale back in July before I even bought it. So now it's just this gigantic mess of this guy actually paid all the back taxes and did everything he was supposed to do, got the deed, but simultaneously I purchased it directly from the seller. Title company did not catch the tax sale stuff, so it's a rat's nest.
Is that where the title insurance steps in?
That's where title insurance steps in, right? So what likely happened in that scenario, and obviously I'm guessing a little bit on the timelines, but title and all these processes associated with like a tax lien sale, they take a couple weeks, right? Even from the time from when they purchase it and stuff. So that might have been in process. You might have closed like basically in parallel at this point. Mm-hmm. And now it's an issue of like, what's going on? And yes, I think actually potentially the original title company missed this, because if there was a bunch of outstanding taxes, somebody should have been paying those outstanding taxes associated with it to clear that. So they, one, probably just messed up. Two, this is probably a piece of it is that they were going on at the same time. And so because there's sort of a delay, especially with the government when they record things and stuff like that, things to get recorded there. But then if you didn't have title insurance, that's where you're screwed, right? Because then you come back and you're like, I don't have anything, and then my only option is to maybe get a lawyer and sue about it, which usually really ends up being, can you sue the title company who might have messed up if you can prove that the title company messed up? And there's just nothing there, and usually in those scenarios, people are just sort of stuck out of luck, especially if if it's a cheaper property for like $20,000. It might cost you more than that to get it back. And it's
I think I paid $1,000 for it, and then after I cleaned it out, I think I sold it for like 10.
Yeah, so at that point, you're just like, it's a loss, and you just move on. But if you have title insurance, that's where you make a claim, and you say, hey, look, title cleared everything, because that's what their job is. That's what they're doing. That's what they do all day long. They cleared everything. They provided me clean title. There's no exceptions to this associated with any of this stuff. They messed up. And I want my money back, right? You may not always get the property back. That's something you should be aware of, because legally sometimes you can't get the property back in those scenarios because of order of priority, but at least you get your money back associated with that. And so
I'll get my purchase and whatever tax or closing costs and all that stuff.
Exactly. And so you get all that back.
I've heard some other terms that I was wondering if you could clarify for us, Palak.
Yeah.
One of those terms is a quitclaim deed. And I think some of these different deed types would not have that protection, right?
Yes. So it's interesting because I think as investors, you guys are going to see a lot more too of people downloading things from the internet and trying to do it that way to save money or because they think they know. A quitclaim deed is a deed that's designed to remove someone's interest in a property. So let's say, Ryan and David, you own a property together, you're 50% owners, and David, you say, I don't want any investment in this property anymore. I'm giving it up, essentially, right? You can sign a quitclaim deed and you can basically remove yourself from title, and Ryan is now the owner of the title. But people think that quitclaim deeds can be used for anything, right? So sometimes they'll be like, hey, and let's take this, scenario 2. You guys own the property and you want to add me to the property, right? Or you want to sell it to me and you're going to sell it to Palak. I'm like, okay. And then you try to sign a quitclaim deed that says Ryan and David give up their interest in property. And by the way, Palak is now going to take over the entire property. That's not right. That's not legally kind of acceptable, if you want to call it that, right? Because that's not what it's designed for. You need a warranty deed that conveys the property correctly to a different person. So there are things, those
and you only
nuances.
get a warranty deed through going through title, right?
I mean, you can technically go through a regular lawyer too, as well, right? And
it's got to go through some sort of legal thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can technically
download
things off the internet. I don't advise it because we get this all the time too. Is people will be like, "Oh, it's not a quitclaim deed; it's a warranty deed." And I'm like, all you did was change the title at the top that says quitclaim deed to warranty deed, but all the legal language underneath there has not been changed and is not correct. Right. So if you download stuff on the internet, I'm going to tell you it's very likely it's going to be a problem. It's so much easier to, like, we do this for investors too, is like, hey, I want to deed this property over to my different LLC after they buy it or something. Man, I'm going to charge you $70 for the deed. I'm going to charge you $30 to record it. If you're one of our ongoing customers that we work with, like, that's it, right? Like, it's much better to just have a title company do it. But there are things like that, right? There specialty warranty deeds, which are associated with when you have odd like easements and restrictions associated with the property. Very common for lots and things associated like rural areas or stuff like that. So there is a source. You've got to pick the right deed and you got to know what the right one is. And the big problem that people have with this is when they don't do those things and then they show up at the title company trying to sell it to somebody else, basically the title company will say, well, none of this stuff is valid, right? And because it's not valid, you got to go back and redo everything, right?
Are there any other types of deeds?
There definitely are, because there's like deeds in lieu of foreclosures and trustee deeds and things like that. They're probably not things you're going to see much more often. I think substitute trustee deeds are an example of one where you'll maybe see more often is where there's a foreclosure, essentially, right? Where the document is then recorded that basically, hey, mortgage company, an example, came in and foreclosed on the property, and in that scenario, the seller doesn't actually sign the deed because they've been foreclosed on, so they're usually not cooperating in any way. So the trustee comes in, who's a lawyer, and does that. But the most common ones you're going to find are going to be the warranty deed is the number one most common. Special warranty deed might come in every little bit now and then, mattering in your area too. Quitclaim deeds are somewhat common, but for you guys to understand, like, our underwriting guidelines are basically that like 75% of quitclaim deeds are fraudulent, right? So you can sometimes get them approved and used if they're done in the correct situation, and we can verify that information. So usually in that scenario, we'd call up the person, like in that first example where David quit claimed out to Ryan, we'd call up David and be like, we need to confirm with you that you signed this. Sometimes they'll just be like, hey, this is just really bad language in the quitclaim deed, so we're just going to ask David to re-sign a warranty deed so it's correct.
Got it.
But those are the kind of situations that you run into, yeah.
Palak, Ryan, I've got to go do a one-on-one with my head of finance. So I just wanted to thank you guys so much for Palak, especially joining us for this episode. And do you only work in Travis County, Texas, or do you work anywhere else?
So HudleyTitle.com, if I'll plug myself for a second, but we're across Texas. So we don't do other states at this point in time. We hopefully expand in the future, but we can do anywhere in Texas with offices, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, wherever you guys need us, Austin obviously too as well. Most of us are in Austin, and then we got people kind of around the state too for doing everything across there. So we've even done El Paso, Panhandle, and all that good stuff too as well.
Yes, and Deal Machine works across the United States. We've got listeners everywhere, but I will say Texas is in the top 3 states of listeners and users of the Deal Machine app. Ryan, yeah. So if you guys are listening and you're like, how do I find a title company? Remember, go to a meetup, ask who the investors are using. If you guys want a copy of my contract, I'm willing to share. Just hit me up at Instagram at DLetGo. And maybe Ryan would as well. He's at Heritage Home Investments on Instagram. Palak, what's your social media?
Ours is just at Hudley Title at Instagram too as well.
Love it. So if you have questions from this episode, hit us up, and actually make sure that you guys are subscribed to this podcast. We've got more info coming to make sure you're successful in real estate investing. Thank you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Machine Real Estate Investing Podcast. Please leave us a review and follow along wherever you're listening to your podcast.